Hey, welcome back to the NOTCAST. It is 13th of June, 2024, and I think it's number 389. And today I am talking about one of Britain's finest exports, responsible for probably the same gross domestic product as, say, a town like Maidenhead. That is Iron Maiden. And today I'm going to be talking about their second album, Killers, released in February 1981, which means this is a staggering 43 years old. I'm also going to talk about a couple of other things. First one is, obviously today is the 13th of June, and on the 13th of June 1993, The Cure played Finsbury Park. I bought this t-shirt that day. The only show by the four-piece version of The Cure, with Boris on drums, Perry on guitar, Simon on bass, and of course Sir Robert of Smith. Simon is a huge Iron Maiden fan. He plays an Iron Maiden song in the solo for Forest on the most recent tour, and also wears a lot of Iron Maiden t-shirts live. So I thought it was appropriate. I don't have too many Iron Maiden t-shirts because, to be honest, I'm an old dude, and an old dude wearing a t-shirt with an image like that on it is a bit silly. I mean, obviously, I like to grow old disgracefully, like the Carter USM lyric, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my idea of disgraceful is the same as Iron Maiden's. The other thing I was going to say, and this follows on from a comment that was made about the Morrissey video that I did yesterday, or not yesterday, but last week, is that apparently somebody stopped watching at 41 minutes because I was a tiny bit sarcastic about Morrissey and formed into some kind of bias. I hold the acts I love to a much higher standard than anybody else, and I always have. As far as I'm concerned, Nine Inch Nails have to reach a higher bar than any other band, or Morrissey, or New Order, or anybody else that I've done on any of the other ones. I hold them to a higher standard. I think they're better than other bands, which is why I like them. I, of course, think I only like brilliant bands. Some of you will probably think, because I haven't done a series about Tool where I analyse every single bass solo and lateralus, that I'm a lesser human being and that I don't have any taste. Au contraire, mon frère, it's a big world. It would be boring if we all like the same thing. The second one is, obviously, the bands that I love, I think are really good. I hold them to high standards. I think they're really good because I think they're really good, and that means that something that they do that is pretty average is probably better than the entire career of Ed Sheeran, for example. Don't be annoyed if you're Ed Sheeran. Sit on your piles of money and enjoy it. And this means that if the acts that I love make decisions that I don't agree with, I'm going to say so. It's not going to be a mindless butt-kissing hagiography where I go, and of course, everything that they ever did was absolutely perfect. Anybody that likes Prince and knows that there's a song called Supercalifragisexy, or I think there's a 51-minute track called, something like, Johnny's Sunglasses, or a track on the Crystal Ball box set called Chlorine Bacon Skin, will know that sometimes the people whose music and art you connect with, they have feet of clay, they make decisions that you don't agree with, up to and including the cover art to put a terrible monster on the cover of everything. In my opinion, maybe these albums would be better if the covers were all black. Originally, it wasn't going to be a glove, if you know what I mean. And as if you follow the concept of, I think the Germans call it a Gerstenweltfunk, a complete work of art. If you look at a record as a mass-produced work of art, and not just the music, and you kind of go, well, the lyrics matter, the cover art matters, the production matters. It's an experience. Everything about it is designed to evoke a series of emotions. Maybe it's an air guitar version of a Voigt Kampf test. But that means that if Iron Maiden or Morrissey do something that I think is not the best idea, I am going to say so. And that's literally kind of how it works here. So if you want something going, everything is amazing, watch the Lego Movie, because everything is awesome. And I will also update you on an Iron Maiden purchase I've made since the last time I talked about Iron Maiden. I had my eyes out for a copy of this, the Soundhouse tapes, the first Iron Maiden EP, and official proper copies of this are very limited. I think there's 5,000 of them. When I look on eBay or Discogs, they're in the hundreds of pounds, £800,000, £900,000. I looked on eBay and somebody had an unofficial counterfeit version of it that reproduced the sleeve labels and everything else, right down to the type of paper. The only difference is this is clear vinyl, not black vinyl. But I thought, well, in order to save myself approximately £860, and because Iron Maiden aren't the band that I absolutely got to own every single original ever, I went, all right, I'll do this. That's okay. I've now got a copy of the Soundhouse tapes. If you want a copy of the Soundhouse tapes, either be incredibly rich or keep your eyes out on eBay. If you're careful and do it at the right time, a copy of this will cost you probably £25. Normal 7 inches are probably around about £15 anyway these days, especially on Record Store Day. So it's not a great leap. It's not a massive rip-off. And sometimes you just got to do it, right? I need £835 more than a second-hand record seller on Discogs needs £835 more. And, you know, the difference incrementally just isn't worth it to me. So, with that in mind, we're going into Iron Maiden's second LP, The Killers. This album did not inspire the name of the band, as fronted by Brandon Flowers. This legendary sophomore albums, the second album, are historically generally tend to be regarded as the difficult album to make. You know, you put your best 12 songs on your first album, then you put your next set of songs on the second album, and that means you have 18-20 years to write your debut and 6 months to write your second album. Not quite the case with Maiden, as we know, because the first two Maiden LPs, this and the debut, are mostly songs that were written before the debut was released, which means that effectively they had a double album to go. They had plenty of tracks, some in various states of completion, but for example, you know, the Ides of March was written in 77, Wrathchild in 76, Another Life in 77, Innocent Exile in 77, Purgatory in 77. These are all songs. So 5 of the songs on this LP are 4 years old by the time this is released. Now, in Guns N' Roses term, blink of an eye. Maiden terms, what that means is for the second album, really they only had to write Murders in the Rue Morgue, Genghis Khan, Killers, and the Twilight Zone track, which is not on every version of the album, and Prodigal Son. So you only have to write 4 songs a year whilst you're touring, and that's a lot of time in sound checks where you just go through ideas, put things into your big box of riffs, work up the song. What that does mean is by the time you get to your third album is the make or break position. It's the one where you kind of go, either, to quote Toy Story, either you're not flying but you're falling with style, or you are actually flying. And it really, flying and falling can feel like the same thing until you hit the ground. Your third album is normally the test. Some bands never even get to the second album. Hello, Sex Pistols. So Killers is a lesser Maiden LP, in my opinion. It's not bad. It's not great. It's not the best one because some of the songs are being written to order. The idea was that, you know, they'd still not written enough stuff for a second album, so they had to recycle material that they'd already issued. And I think Drifter on here, there's a live version that's on a B-side of one of the previous singles. Actually, I do need to check on the first 10 years box set. This is a CD edition. I think there's a live version of Drifter on, and let me quickly check. Yep, on the Sanctuary single, alongside a cover of Montrose's I've Got the Fire. And there weren't a huge amount of singles that were released from this album. There was effectively just one, actually, that came out, and the other single that was released was actually a non-album track. So although it was released at roughly the same time, which means that, surprisingly, for a band that didn't have that many songs, they put one of their A-sides onto off the album, and it didn't get on there at all. So obviously, following the debacle that we had, debacle is such a good word, isn't it? I should use it more often, for Women in Uniform. They decided not to include Women in Uniform on the album, on the grounds that they didn't want to dilute the publishing. They didn't want to put a cover version on any of the albums. Now, technically, There are in fact two cover versions on Iron Maiden records. One is Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter, which was a Bruce Dickinson solo track, but it's really the singer and his band covering a solo song that the solo singer had written and recorded in a solo capacity. The other one is the opening track on the album, The Ides of March, side 1, track 1, which is based in large on a track called Thunderburst by Samson. And Samson had a drummer who I think was called Thunderstick, and I think Thunderstick played in Iron Maiden briefly. So he brought that song to Iron Maiden, and then Iron Maiden bought the rights to it. So if you listen to Thunderburst by Samson and you listen to The Ides of March, they are very, very similar indeed, to the point of being almost identical, or, to follow copyright law, able to confuse a moron in a hurry that they are the same thing. This is a early 80s version of Killers. This isn't, I don't think this is one of the Fame reissues. I think this is a 1981 EMI version, which means that it doesn't have the slightly revised track listing that's on the CD. So when I was talking about Twilight Zone, for example, Twilight Zone is on the CD. This is the 1998 remaster series. It's not on the original vinyl editions or the original CD editions. So I think Twilight Zone first got its CD release in 1990 on the box set, which I've mentioned previously. Killers is a damn good LP. First and foremost, I think this is produced, engineered and bullied by Martin Headmaster Birch, the man that produced every Maiden album up to 1992. And that means this is the start of the classic Maiden sounds. Some bands ally themselves with a producer who becomes almost regarded as the fifth Beatle. George Martin, for example, Martin Birch for Iron Maiden, Rick Rubin, for the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who are awful and I hate them, and other people with a similar kind of lineage. They have a producer that allies himself to a band. Stuart Price made 3 albums with Pet Shop Boys that are really good, for example. Martin Hannett did the 2 Joy Division albums. A producer becomes effectively an extension of the band, and this is where Martin Birch's role came in. His role, not in writing songs, not in performing live, it was in making Iron Maiden sound like Iron Maiden when they went on record. And what a great bit of production this is. This is the first really well-produced Maiden LP. It captures a moment in time that existed only briefly, for the lineup that made this album only made one album. And the lineup has changed. Dennis Stratton had left the group, and I think the reason Dennis left because he was less bothered with the Iron Maiden style. He wasn't as interested in the punky, aggressive side. He was quite happy to play, relatively standard rock, which of course Maiden wasn't. And then they recruited a new guitar player, Sir Adrian Smith. There, very small picture of Adrian. Adrian had played in some other bands, including, I think, Girl was one of them. In 1982, Adrian was asked if he wanted to join Def Leppard to replace, I think, is it Steve Collins, I think, had left, I think, at that point, or Peter Wallace, I think, had left, and he was asked to replace him in Iron Maiden, but he turned it down, and Phil Collen got the gig instead, actually. So, and Phil has been Def Leppard's guitarist since 1982. So probably a good move for everyone all around, I think. And Adrian has been Maiden's guitarist, apart from a short break of about 8 years, since 1980. So this is the start of the solidification, I think, of the band's lineup. Some bands, as they start, when they start, that's the classic lineup. Some other bands, as they kind of evolve and they go through time and they add and lose members, eventually they stabilise. Like Foo Fighters probably got their lineup really settled when Taylor Hawkins joined in 1999 or thereabouts. Kraftwerk got their lineup settled when Carl joined in 1974. Iron Maiden really formed into being Iron Maiden probably around about the time that Adrian joined in 1980. And this was a watershed album in that respect. It showed that Iron Maiden weren't just a flash in the pan, even though a lot of the songs had previously been released. So the second track on the album, Wrathchild, was released on the Metal for Mothers compilation in early 1980 before the debut album came out. Sanctuary, of course, was on Metal for Mothers as well, and I showed you Metal for Mothers on the previous episode. But what we did have was, even though the first two songs on the album were, if you were particularly into the scene, known to you already. You will have bought a copy of Metal for Mothers in 1980. You will have bought a copy of the Samson record, which I think has Thunderburst on it. What you would have is a slightly different LP here. The songwriting has moved on a little. The lyrics, still a bit rapey, a little bit murdery, a little bit sex offendery. Sorry about that. But the rest of it, it seems to be taking a few leaps ahead. Now, Maiden hadn't become the prog metal epic history teachers that they were to become shortly. Everything I learnt about world history I learnt from Iron Maiden, for example. Was a fantastic web page that was very popular in the 90s when I just got onto the interwebs. But what Iron Maiden were at this point was this kind of almost unique proposition, a cross between the legacy of punk and a new form or a new wave of British heavy metal. And obviously the vocalist in the band is the person that primarily defines the band's identity when you listen to it. You can replicate guitars, effects pedals. What you can't replicate is your larynx, your thorax, your throat. You can't duplicate that. Nowadays, of course, you can probably run Paul Di'Anno sings "Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter" into AI and get an answer. Although Paul Di'Anno has sung "Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter" on a tribute LP, which I'll address when we get to that point in the band's history. But what you don't have is you can't replicate the human voice. That's the unique identifier that we've got, and every good brand has to have what it's called its USP, its unique selling point, which is why some bands, when they change singers, they take huge leaps. Faith No More took an enormous leap in popularity when Mike Patton became their vocalist. At the same point, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, Iron Maiden in 1995 with Blaze Bayley on vocals, Judas Priest when they had Tim Ripper Owens on vocals, they weren't as popular. And they weren't as popular because people preferred the other version of the band. Because your USP, the thing that when you listen to it, you hear the voice, and the voice can't be replicated. And it's an indefinable quality and characteristic. You listen to it and you suddenly go, that's the band. That's what makes Pink Floyd, Kraftwerk, Depeche Mode. That's what makes them, them. And for a band like Maiden, it's the voice, it's the throat. It's more than anything else. It's the human voice that's in there. And that's a fascinating thing. And this was Paul's last album with the band, which I'll get to at the end of the period. But they really went kind of, you could really start to see and hear the limitations of Paul's vocal range. So the Venn diagram of things that Iron Maiden wanted to do and things that Paul Di'Anno's voice would allow him to do, was the little area where the two overlapped was really getting quite small. The material that the band were going to write after this, songs like Children of the Damned, Hallowed Be Thy Name, Power Slave title track, for example, Aces High, The Trooper, the vocal registers on those are things that Paul Di'Anno just cannot hit. It's not in his skill set. So this is the last album by Iron Maiden as a punk rock kind of hybrid, as opposed to a band that becomes an operatic piece of prog metal. And that sounds judgmental. It isn't. But would I like this if it was a different band with a different name? No, absolutely I wouldn't. It's because I got into Maiden when I was listening to Bruce Dickinson's version of the band in 1987, 1988, when I was at school as a 14-year-old. You know, they had the Dead in Battle jackets with the huge covers of Live After Death stitched onto the back of it, furtive tapes. You know, between us we had one record collection, the four of us, myself, Adam, Dennis, Paul, and Clemmy. We would sit in a bedroom, you know, with a bunk bed on, 3 on one, 2 on the other, one in the corner. We'd listen to dub tapes of Iron Maiden live albums, and we'd do what 14, 15-year-olds always do, which is talk shit about imaginary girlfriends, read Kerrang, and desperately hope that somehow a huge pile of money would fall into our laps. So to me, listening to this album is the sound of my adolescence, and listening to it as a not 15 but 50-year-old is a very different experience. I can still remember the 15-year-old version of me, and he's somewhere buried deep inside me, but the 50-year-old version of me is looking at some of these lyrics and going, Christ, those are bad. You know, if you think about films that they show from the 80s, and it goes, oh, this film reflects, you know, the cultural normality of the time. You watch Ghostbusters and there's a load of smoke in. You watch Trading Places and it's in this and cigarette smoke that and everyone's everything. And it's like, whoa, that stuff's aged like milk. Some of the Iron Maiden lyrics have aged like milk. Some of the covers equally so. But then you think, it's a product of its time, in much the same way that I'm the product of my time. And the time that I was produced was approximately Christmas Eve 1972, because I was born prematurely. And so, with that in mind, Killers is an album that at the time was probably absolutely phenomenal, but in retrospect, isn't as good as perhaps I did think it was when I was 15, and not necessarily an album I would have liked and listened to had Iron Maiden ended with the very last note of the very last song on this album, Drifter. I probably would have thought of them as the redeemable Scorpions, without terrible album titles like Virgin Killer and Love at First Sting. Please don't Google Scorpions album covers. They are horrendous, sexist, vile and repugnant. Even the good ones, let alone the bad ones. Which means, of course, I have to say some of the Iron Maiden covers are not great either. But Killers is a pretty good one, all things considered. There's Electric Matthew saying, "I'm going to kill you. I've got a machete or an axe there." What is surprising is that Women in Uniform isn't on the album. Actually, it's a non-album track. And I do wonder why it's not on, but at the same point I understand that the band didn't want to have any cover versions on. Women in Uniform was a signifier of the band reasserting themselves and dominion and control over their legacy, and putting Women in Uniform on the album would have been regarded, I think, even though it would have made the album a lot stronger, could probably be regarded as a admission, not necessarily of defeat, but of lack of control, really, is probably the way to look at it. So if you were going to think about resequencing the album, you'd have Ides of March, Wrathchild, probably Murders in the Rue Morgue, Killers, and then Women in Uniform, which would be a good way of thematically and sonically creating a faster, better album than it is. The sequencing is a little off. So this record is pretty good, not amazing. It's punky in approach. You start to see the introduction of the classical double harmony guitars with Adrian and Dave playing against each other. Dennis obviously less bothered about the Iron Maiden style and more into classic rock. Adrian was more adaptable to Maiden's style, the twin guitar harmonies. And certain early versions of the band and the current version of the band have three guitar players like Lynyrd Skynyrd, which apparently, according to Stephen Bruce, was what they always wanted anyway. It was more metal in approach, it was less punky. There was the double harmonies, which were very similar to Thin Lizzy. And the Deep Purple also had double harmonies in what they did, although I don't like Deep Purple. And even all the way down to thinking about something like The Angel and the Gambler, which is from 1998's Virtual 11, which has a John Lord style keyboard solo. Those influences are starting to come in at this point. So this record, plenty to recommend it. I do like it. Some classics that the band play live. I think Wrathchild, I've seen them play. Murders in the Rue Morgue, possibly Killers. Not all of the other ones, but so be it. It was preceded by a single, and the single was, and let me just quickly check, Twilight Zone and Wrathchild, I believe. So this is the 7-inch of Twilight Zone and Wrathchild, double A sides. Wrathchild was chosen because they'd shot a video at the Live at the Rainbow VHS. The Live at the Rainbow VHS is currently available on the DVD of Iron Maiden, The Early Years, which is a 30-minute, highly edited version of the live show. This does feature, Live at the Rainbow, does feature an early version of Killers. So I think it's the Adrian Smith version of the band just before the band recorded the album. Let me just quickly check the details on here. So recorded in December 1980, so 2 months before the album came out, when premiering live versions of Ides of March, Wrathchild, Killers on there. So the version of Killers that's on Live at the Rainbow, by the way, is not finished. So the lyrics are primitive, the arrangement isn't quite there. There's still a bit of work to do. So it was probably finished late December 1980 and somehow in the shops on the 2nd of February 1981 and followed up with a tour. The other track that's on here is Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone is a non-album track. I think originally they thought about writing a B-side. Then they realised it was so good, it should be an A-side. So this is an Iron Maiden AA single of Twilight Zone and Wrathchild. And Twilight Zone is a pretty good track. It was originally on the US version of the album in 1980. The Australian version of the album, I believe, had Women in Uniform on, because the Women in Uniform was a cover of an Australian band called Skyhawks. I think Twilight Zone should always have been on the record. So somewhat oddly, even though the first version of the album that I ever had was there was a tape of this, I've grown to think of it as having Twilight Zone in it as per the 1998 CD. So lyrics, the lyrics are bad. Okay, the lyrics are actually pretty offensive, come to think of it. So we've got Wrathchild, which of course is about revenge and murder. And don't worry, I'm going to bring the swarm scale up of sorcery, war, armaments, all those type of things shortly. Murders in the Rue Morgue. Well, that's actually, I should probably count how many murders there are in this album. Which, let's say, Wrathchild's a murder. Okay, I would say Murders in the Rue Morgue. That's got at least 2 murders in it. Another Life, I think that's about somebody that's dying, so maybe that's a murder too. Innocent Exile, he mentions that he's defying the law. That's probably a murder of some description, I would have thought. And then we would have had, and we move over to the next part of it, Killers. Obviously quite a lot of murders in the Killers title track. Scream for Mercy, he laughs as he's watching you bleed. A killer behind you, his bloodlust defies all needs. I've always felt uncomfortable about the lyrics of that track. Because basically they are sexist, misogynist, objectifying women. And basically, if these lyrics were a person, he'd be on the sex offenders register. We have Prodigal Son. The devil's got a hold of my soul. I've got this curse and it's driving me mad. Okay, no murders, just merely selling your soul to the devil. So let's say probably 4 or 5 murders at the point in this album already. Then we've got Purgatory. Let me just see what we've got in here. I don't think we've got any murders in Purgatory, but of course we do have the concept of death and the afterlife. So let's say that counts as 1. So we're on 6 murders so far in Killers, which is probably appropriate for an album called Killers. And then we've got Twilight Zone. Okay, so that's about a man falling in love with a ghost, which is weird. And then Drifter. Has Drifter got any murders in it? Oh no, just random sex. So that's pretty exciting, really. Again, not the best lyrics in the world. Some people go, it's really hard to write good lyrics, and well, the answer is no, it isn't. It isn't hard to write good lyrics. If you can put together a sentence, you can write a decent lyric. Think about what bothers you, and then put it together. I also say the rhyming structure on Killers is very, very conventional. So most people think about lyrics as being everything's got to rhyme all the time, every single line, and everything's got to be fine. Yeah, all right. So that's what's called an A structure, where the last syllable of each line rhymes with the preceding line before it. Sometimes you go in AB. So that's where every line rhymes apart from every alternate set of lines. And although the second set of lines has to be different from the first. So first line rhymes, second line don't, third line rhymes, fourth one won't. That's how it works on an AB structure, by the way. The really good ones are where actually you run something like an A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you go for an A again, but then that gives you 14 lines, for example. But then sometimes you might want to bring back one of the other lines, so in fact you repeat a line 3 times. I don't quite know how to articulate that, but let's put it this way. The lyrics are not the strong point of this album. The sound is the strong point of this album. The words are not. The guitars, the riffs, the drums, they're fabulous. This album would be better with somebody else that's not Bruce Diano singing. Sorry, Bruce. Sorry, not Paul. Sorry, Paul. But there you are. It's been a long week. Forgive me. Maybe not as long as Iron Maiden's longest song, which I think is it Empire of the Clouds, 18 minutes. That's the longest Iron Maiden song. Not as long as that, just feels that long. So we have the album here, and obviously of the tracks which you've already heard. If you bought everything as it came out, you will have heard Wrathchild, you will have heard Killers live, you will have heard Purgatory. So it's perhaps like a lot of second albums, a number of the songs are already familiar to you, and it's only in retrospect, looking at them ages later, you then go, actually, it holds together as an album, as opposed to that sense of disappointment where you could go, well, I've heard every song on the album already, and it's not that exciting a proposition. So what happened after the album was released? Well, touring, singles. The band did TV broadcasts from Bremen, on Italian television, and of course live at the Rainbow. They did a second single from the album. It was called Purgatory. That's the cover to Purgatory, and it's backed with Genghis Khan. This is the lowest, Purgatory and Genghis Khan is the lowest selling, lowest charting Iron Maiden single, I think, in the days when the band did physical releases. It got to number 52 in the charts, and it got to number 52 in the charts for a very simple reason. The A and the B side were already on the album. And despite what bands think, people don't buy singles to get the covers. I bought singles to get the B-sides, which means that some of the songs I know best out of the Iron Maiden catalogue are the B-sides. Songs like Sheriff of Huddersfield, Charlotte the Harlot 88, Black Bart Blues, for example, Kill Me Ce Soir. These are the songs which actually I listen to death, the B-sides. The album tracks, sometimes not so much, actually. And of course, if you do a single where the A side and the B side are both on the album, unless you're the kind of guy that does a Pikachu of rock and has to catch them all, it doesn't really matter. So that got to number 52 in the charts. What I will tell you is the cover of Purgatory was created at the last minute, because the original cover art, the band looked at and went, that's too good to go on the cover of Purgatory. It went on the cover of Number of the Beast. And then the next release that they did was a little unusual. It wasn't actually a single, it was an EP. The EP is Maiden Japan, taking its name from, I think, the Deep Purple album itself, which was a live album recorded somewhere and has a Maiden joke. This is the 12-inch of Maiden Japan. It says £3.50 because that's how much I paid for it. It was one of the few things that I kept from my Maiden collection when I was a kid. This is the UK 12-inch. It has Running Free, Remember Tomorrow, Killers, and Innocent Exile on a 12-inch disc. And this record is dedicated to all the headbangers, earth dogs, and metal merchants around the world for making our first world tour a success. So this was recorded in Japan, and I don't remember exactly where. I think it's Tokyo in 1981. And this was the last release with Paul Di'Anno on vocals. Originally, there was a cover which was intended to have Maiden holding, or Eddie holding, Paul Di'Anno's severed head, which was used by mistake, I think, in Brazil and Argentina, but not anywhere else. But after the band made the decision to remove Paul from the band, although there's a story about that, they decided to change the cover so it didn't look too obvious. Instead, they did use, in 1993, the cover of the single, can't remember which one now, I think it's Hallowed Be Thy Name, of Bruce getting stabbed through the heart by Eddie when Bruce decided that he was going to leave the band as well. Surely it's not a surprise to you that Bruce leaves the band, by the way, because that was only 31 years ago, and you're not living under a rock. So, Maiden Japan had 4 tracks in the UK. It had 5 in the rest of the world. UK chart restrictions meant that in order for Maiden Japan to chart in the UK, you could only have 4 songs on it. The rest of the world didn't have these restrictions, and so therefore there was an extra track that was on the international edition of Maiden Japan. I can't remember which one it is. You'll just have to find out yourself, I think. Archive releases. There are, if you have Eddie's archive from 2002, the BBC archives contain a 1979 radio session with Paul, but also the closest thing to an official Paul Di'Anno era live album that we have from the band, which was recorded at the Reading Festival in 1980 and features Prowler, Remember Tomorrow, Killers, Running Free, Transylvania and Iron Maiden. It's still only 7 songs, but The Rainbow is only 6 songs. There is no full-length official Paul Di'Anno era live release from the band. In fact, the nearest thing that came to it was released in Greece in 1986 or 1985. It is Iron Maiden Live +1. This was deleted in about 1987. It was released in Greece in 1984. If you want a copy, the minimum price is probably going to be about £25 to £30 now for a vinyl edition. To get a good quality copy, you'll be looking at upwards of 50 quid because it was only released in one country and only for a few years. Vinyl only. This features 9 tracks on it, 7 live plus 2 studio recordings. So officially it says Drifter, Fandom of the Opera, Women in Uniform, that's a studio version, and Innocent Exile live. And on the B it says it's Sanctuary, Prowler live, although I think that's a studio version. Running Free live, Remember Tomorrow live, and I've Got the Fire. So it's a compilation of Paul Di'Anno era live B-sides plus Women in Uniform, mislabeled version of Prowler that was only released in Greece. It's hard to get. It's a bloody good listen, by the way, and it's an essential part of my Iron Maiden collection, this one. So I'm a huge fan of it, but hard to get. And this was probably actually this should come out for Record Store Day, I reckon, and put it out again. But if you get a chance to pick one up, there aren't many around in the UK, and even less are for sale. So do give it a look. When I last looked, there was 1 copy for sale, and it was about £60. This one cost me 24, because as you can probably tell, it was a bit beaten up, a bit loved, and a bit difficult to get. So Paul was fired from the band for alcohol use and cocaine. A 126-date tour across the world, which went to included Hammersmith Odeon. Included in Germany, they had to cancel 5 dates because Paul lost his voice. He was staying up too late. He was smoking, drinking, doing cocaine, missed rehearsals, and he was covering for his imposter syndrome, his feeling of nervousness and not necessarily being the right person for the job, by drinking, smoking, brandy, coke, speed, fast cars, fast women, fast drinking. And there was I think on the outside of it, Paul wasn't technically the best singer that's ever been in the band. My voice is probably better than his, probably, but I don't want to sing that music all day long. And Paul was more of an instinctual singer than a musician, not necessarily technically qualified when it comes to things like keys and pitch and control and stuff like that. But it was spirit, and spirit really matters. There's a concept called verisimilitude, which is the appearance of truth. And if you don't express verisimilitude, it sounds like you're faking and being sarcastic. So, for example, even if Pavarotti was the right guy to front Iron Maiden, to hear him singing about, killers behind you, you'd be like, no, it doesn't work. It doesn't matter how good technically he is, the voice doesn't fit. Paul's voice fit these songs, but it wasn't a great voice. It was, and if the voice is the engine, then the engine defines how fast and how far the vehicle can go. And Maiden wanted to go in a different direction. They needed a different singer. They needed somebody that didn't have imposter syndrome. They didn't have a guy that cancelled dates because he'd taken too much coke and drunk too much. And when Paul went into the office and was come in for a meeting and have a chat and we'll work out what we do next, he was told, you're fired. Although apparently the next thing that came out of his mouth was, well, that's okay, I was going to quit anyway. Now, how much of that is true? How much of that is not true? I don't know. How much of that is the Nirvana line, you can't fire me because I quit? Again, I don't know. But what that meant was Maiden were going into 1981, the end of 1981, without a vocalist. But they already had a guy lined up. And they just needed to make sure that it was the right choice. Unlike the other time when they needed to replace their lead singer in 1993, Maiden had it in their minds that perhaps the singer wasn't the guy to take them to the next level. And sometimes you get to the point, especially on your third album, where you kind of think, well, either I do this and I do it properly, or I don't do it at all. Iron Maiden decided it was time to do it properly. They'd already got to the point of headlining Hammersmith. They'd already got to the point of doing a world tour, a 126-date world tour. They'd already got to the point of having a fan base. People had Maiden tattoos. This is not a band that's going to be small at all. This is a band that's on the ascendant. It's going to go to great things in future. And this meant that they had to really be able to execute it and to take it to where it needs to go. This is Iron Maiden's Killers, and this is the end of Iron Maiden as a band at the new wave of British heavy metal. The next steps that they take, the next steps are going to be the number of the beast. They're going to conquer the universe. And in the meantime, I am going to pick up, and I think as I mentioned before, what happened next. What I think should have happened next, and again, you can't rewrite history after it's happened, but imagine if you're Steve Jones and Paul Cook, ex of the Sex Pistols, and you suddenly find that John Lydon has left the group. Iron Maiden have fired their singer. Sex Pistols are one of Paul Di'Anno's favourite bands. What happens next? Personally, they should have got Paul into front of the Ex Pistols and see where that goes. But life's too short for ifs and buts and hallybuts. We have to play the cards that we're dealt and live with the choices that we've got. And overall, Killers is a great record. It's not an amazing record. It's an important part of the Maiden story, and it takes you on to where the band are going to go next. And where the band are going to go next is to conquer the universe and the underworld with the number of the beast. So that's it. I'm going to wrap up talking about Iron Maiden now. Thank you very much if you've made it all the way to the end. If you quit beforehand, it doesn't matter what I say because you're not watching it. So to you, and I will take care of yourselves and each other. Stay beautiful, and I will see you all soon. So, as Steve Harris says, some cunt's recording this. So I'm going to press the off button now. There you go. Seamless, isn't it?